It's my pleasure to welcome you back and also to welcome Katie as our speaker for this session. I'm Stephen Robinson and I teach at Bridgetine College at Indooroopilly. And Katie has had the bad fortune to be one of my former students. I met her 20 years ago and she rose to the dizzy heights of being our school captain. One of her great features was that she always talked the talk, but she was always prepared to walk the walk. So I know that we're going to be in for a really informative and inspirational session. So would you like to welcome Katie Lipka?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Can everyone hear me at the back there? Sorry, I'm not used to the roaming mic pinned to my lapel. I'm very humbled to have been introduced by Mr. Robinson, and I know he'll roll his eyes when I say this, but he was an exceptional teacher, he still is, and I fondly remember him. So it's a real joy to see him again today. Thank you. And thank you to ETAC so much for inviting the QCAA to be a part of the masterclasses again. We're here, the officers. We can't wait to get around to the sessions that follow to whet our appetites as well regarding how Queensland teachers are going to enliven this curriculum from 2019 onwards. I'd also like to acknowledge Kathy and her session regarding the waste system. It's always fantastic to hear from our colleagues regarding the implications of external assessment for them and how it works in their state. And hopefully following this session and the sessions that follow, it won't feel like, if it does at the moment, such a monster in the cupboard or under the bed, that external assessment piece, because we will speak to that today. So essentially this session intends to offer an overview of Unit 4, what the syllabus sets up, prescribes and so on for us to implement in our classrooms. We'll also spend a little bit of time looking at the key dates for Unit 4 as important to teaching, learning and assessment planning, and the resources and information that are available to our sisters from the QCAA already, that are already in the public domain. But really, as has been the message at syllabus implementation workshops, which I'm sure many of you have attended, we know Queensland teachers are best placed to anticipate this change. Yes, it can be nerve-wracking and it can be stressful and anxiety-raising, but you know your kids, you know your cohorts, and yes, we are adding an external assessment to what we do, but we are still designing a curriculum for our students in our classrooms, and our Queensland teachers are still the accredited assessors that will moderate the work in our system. Before I continue, I know it was mentioned at the start today, but as a QCAA officer, I would just like to acknowledge as well the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, past, present and future. Stephen's already mentioned my name and that we'll have questions at the end. As a Principal Education Officer, just to let you know, if I haven't spoken to you in the past, also as a Senior Education Officer supporting schools in the current system and panels, we've got verification on Monday. Please feel free to touch base at any point in time. We are here to support and assist you. That's what we do, and we will be next year as well regarding implementation. So if your questions aren't answered today, please do follow up, because we'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction to the unit who can answer, or to talk it through with you regarding your particular schooling context as well. But I want to know a little bit about you. Very quickly, if you've been to a syllabus implementation workshop, you'll know the drill here. Can you please raise your hand if the question applies to you? So, no judgment, who has had the opportunity to read the English 2019 syllabus? Well done, team. What about the English as an additional learners syllabus? Thank you. The literature syllabus. Great. All right. So who has attended a syllabus implementation workshop for any of those general English? Look at you go. So there'll be a fair bit of information presented today that you may have heard before, but hopefully it's synthesised for Unit 4 and the context that we're considering today. Who is planning to offer English from 2019? EAL or literature, or all three from 2019? The reason I ask that question is because if you've of course read or engaged with those syllabus documents closely, you'll know that they share the same syllabus objectives. And actually Unit 4 is not dissimilar for each of those syllabuses. So that's interesting when we think about planning in the English learning areas of our schools as well. Who has started planning Unit 4 for 2020 English? Yeah, some people are sort of, yeah, not quite sure yet. And here's the biggie, isn't it? Everyone's asking, and I can't wait to walk around at lunch and hear what's going on with external assessment texts. Who's chosen both of their prescribed text lists for the Unit 4? Wonderful. Okay, it's fine to be undecided at this point. Yeah, there's still some waving back at me there. Thank you. So this is the strategy for this session. I'm actually going to stick very closely to script so that I don't miss anything. My apologies in that, and so that I do make sure there's sufficient time for questions at the end. I've started my stopwatch. I'm keeping an eye on it. But what we're going to do is really start by looking at the big picture regarding Unit 4. Where does it sit in the course of study, other than as that unit with the external assessment, which is really a limited misrepresentation of this unit when we look at what it can do and what it offers students in our course of study. And so then we'll consider what is specific to Unit 4, including the timelines and resources available to us. And then we'll talk about some more specific assessment considerations. And there will be some consideration, obviously, of the external assessment there, but also of our other examination that we design as Queensland teachers, our imaginative response to a scene paper, where we use one of the prescribed texts from the list as a springboard. And so here's Unit 4. So what is it to the course of study? Well, Unit 4 is the final and perhaps, in a sense, the culminating unit in our course of study. It's the close study of literary texts from diverse times and places that allows for the exploration of how texts build understanding of the human experience. And it allows students to engage both creatively and critically with literary texts, so hence the two topics, the two assessment instruments, and the study of two texts from the prescribed text list. But of course, when we talk about it, the creative engagement and the critical engagement with literary text is not really a mutually exclusive relationship. It is important again to acknowledge that English, EAL and literature have very similar units here. We're focusing on the imaginative and the analytical text types in response to literature. We have two papers when we talk about the external assessment. Why? We know that literature has its own prescribed text list because the context in which they enact the syllabus objectives is different in relation to text selection. We know they focus only on the literary. And then we've got a paper for English and EAL. They will share that paper because we share the same assessment texts from that prescribed text list. When we talk about the summative internal assessment instrument that sits there, actually we already do this in so many ways in Queensland. Not everybody uses the imaginative text type for the scene paper, but I tell you what, a lot of schools do. And a lot of schools already use a literary text as a springboard for that imaginative response. We have a lot to bring to the assessment instruments that are prescribed by this syllabus. And we actually have a lot to bring to the external assessment because it's what many students have just done prior to verification, isn't it? It's the unseen question in response to the close study of a literary text. Yes, we don't know the question. As teachers, that's a little bit concerning for some of us. And yes, there will be no quotation booklet or text allowed in the exam. If you haven't heard that yet, take a breath. It's okay. We'll unpack why that's the case later on and how to go about working with that. It's also important, I'm just going to set this reminder again, that our external assessment is worth 25% of a student's subject result. It is not used to scale the internal subject results of the other three assessment instruments, including the spoken signed, that are worth 25%, that we mark and that Queensland teachers moderate in the process of confirmation. And yes, it was beautifully set up by Kathy. Please get involved in our moderation processes. Course 5 has gone live for confirmation. So the more we're involved in these processes, obviously, the better for our students as well. And there are so many opportunities for that to happen. But other than at the end, what is the role really of Unit 4? I'm going to speak to the rationale of the syllabus, which, can we encourage you to use your syllabus documents with your students, as Kathy was saying, as often as possible? I didn't use the 2010 rationale often enough, and I should have, because this is based on the English 2010 rationale as well. And it really establishes, when students walk out of that exam at the end of 2020 Who are they supposed to be? And what we can see in this statement is the 21st century skills. We can see students' study of literary and non-literary texts, their analysis and creation of varied texts. It's not so different to the 2010 rationale, as we've said, but what a wonderful aim for Queensland English students starting next year, and for us to return to and for them to add to across the course of study, and then return to when we go to that external assessment, but also that summative internal assessment 3, and say, what have you got at this point of time in your repertoire of skills, hopefully? It's really not hard to see how Unit 4 relates to this statement. But it's also worth keeping in mind when we backward map that in Unit 4, what our assessment demands, but also what the unit description and the subject matter of the syllabus demands, is that they've developed as independent, innovative, creative learners and thinkers at this point. We do need to keep that in mind. And we know that that begins long before the senior course of study. We know that, and people have already been talking in syllabus implementation workshops about where does analytical writing and thinking fit within our framework from 7 to 12, without killing the text, without hammering the essay year after year after year. How do we develop these skills in our students? And the same goes for creative writing as well. But when we look from Unit 1 to Unit 4, we know, as we currently do with our English 2010 syllabus with assessment, this is intended to be a course of increasing complexity of study. And that's how the units have been designed in consultation with Queensland teachers. And that Units 1 and 2 offer opportunities for foundational learning, and that students need to be presented with opportunities to experience and respond to the types of assessment they will encounter in Units 3, but also in Units 4. So this really shouldn't be the first time when they get to Unit 4 that they've engaged probably in analytical essay writing. We know that there's mock external assessment that the QCAA will provide in semester 2 of 2019, and it will be for the text from the external assessment prescribed text list for them to sort of engage with and look at and deconstruct, and ourselves as teachers. Those mock assessments are going through the same level of scrutiny as the papers will for 2020. We've had people apply as accredited assessors to be part of that. We know that it won't be the first time, if we're designing the course of study in this way, that they'll have engaged with literary texts and their own creative writing processes as well. We know that when they get to Unit 3, they'll have actually engaged with at least one prescribed text from the prescribed text list, and they'll have done an analytical comparison of concepts in those texts with perhaps another text of another text category from that list. They bring an awful lot to Unit 4 when we consider this. And really, again, they're at that point where they are hopefully independent, innovative, creative learners and thinkers who appreciate the aesthetic use of language, analyse perspectives and evidence, and challenge ideas and interpretations through the analysis and creation of varied texts, as established by our syllabus rationale. That's where they're at. And when you place these units side by side, and we will in a moment when we look at the TLAPs, the Teaching, Learning and Assessment Plans, Unit 1 is the stepping stone for Unit 3. You can see it in the unit objectives, you can see it in the descriptions. They're engaging in assessment as well in analytical and persuasive text types. When we talk about Unit 2, it's the stepping stone for Unit 4. And in assessment, they're intended to be engaging with imaginative and analytical text types here as well. Just another section of the syllabus to note that would be lovely to have up in a classroom, that literacy is not just for NAPLAN or for primary years and so on, it's for all of us and it's ongoing. And I love this definition of this underpinning factor from the syllabus, that it's about refining a repertoire of skills and practices. And students continue to do this in Unit 4. But where does Unit 4 fit? Or perhaps more so, we're up to now, aren't we? Where is Unit 4 regarding the specifics of this unit? What do we actually need to do? It's not just at the end. What are they actually going to bring as a repertoire of skills to this unit by this time? There's some classroom considerations that we'll speak to now. And we've already set up this first point. We know about formative learning and the foundational course of study and increasing complexity and and familiarity with assessment. They're course organising principles currently. But we will in a moment, and you're welcome to take a photo of the slide, but keep in mind ETAC will provide this presentation as well on the website. The timing of the quality assurance processes that attend the summative units 3 and 4 and what that means for Unit 4. And we'll also look as well to the opportunities presented by the selection of literary text from the prescribed text list. I'm not going to provide answers today. I'm going to encourage you to get out amongst your community of practice, because we're all here in so many ways representing our schools, and think about the coupling of the 2 prescribed texts from the list for both assessment instruments. But also hopefully in a moment how the subject matter assessment objectives and instruments prescribed actually provide opportunities for the development of skills and strategies specific to this unit and to each topic in Unit 4. So we've already offered this definition today about what's specific to Unit 4. And here are the 2 topics that fall out of the unit. And so the unit objectives are arranged to meet these 2, and then the subject matter of the syllabus is actually arranged by topic as well. And again, I'm just going to emphasise this point that really, at this point in the course, and we speak about this in text selection in the syllabus in section 2.5, that up to and including this point, students should have engaged with a wide range of texts to encourage their development as language learners and users, that students have been encouraged to read widely across the course, and so the close study of literary texts at this point should not be a shock. It shouldn't be alarming by the time the students get to this point. And that this relationship between the creative and the critical in our planning, I'm going to quote my favourite part of our syllabus, and it sits again under section 1.2.5 in aesthetic features and stylistic devices. It's this: the experience of reading aesthetic texts and the experience of writing them are closely related. The more students engage with the aesthetic dimension of texts, the more they learn to read with their own writing in mind and to write with their reader in mind. And when we talk about the TLAP shortly, when you look at the writing skill development that's offered in the Unit 2 TLAP and the Unit 4 TLAP, you can see that while students, for example, are using texts as prompts for creative writing, they're critically engaging with those texts in the first instance as well. They're engaging with the meta language that attends our syllabus to understand how they construct their own narratives, etc., but also how other people do that. And here are our unit objectives for Unit 4. And in the syllabus implementation workshops, we talked about the fact that they just aren't so different to the 2010 objectives, are they? They're very, very similar, and they informed these objectives. We know that we don't evaluate per our syllabus glossary in the 2019 syllabus because the definition for analysis offered by the Mazzano and Kendall taxonomy and so on actually incorporates what we do in English when we talk about analysis specific to our subject area, as opposed to evaluation, for example, by criteria in geography and other subject areas. And by the time we get to this point in the course of study, students should know what this means. They should. And they should know via the teaching, learning and assessment experiences that we offer in our classrooms. They're engaging hopefully directly with these in our teaching objectives of our lessons and so on. And currently, on the QCAA website, in the current system, for English, there's a beautiful video of students talking about why they love English. And I don't know if many people have seen it, but as the kids talk, they talk the cognitions of the subject. They're explaining our subject using our syllabus language, including aesthetic features and devices. And that must be so empowering for those students and for those teachers in providing feedback in that space as well. So this is not new to us. Just on that note, again, and it was acknowledged by Kathy, that support around understanding what our subject-specific terms, thank you very much, Gary.
That's not a cognition, that's more.
Thank you, thank you. Understanding the cognitions of our syllabus and so on is important, but support in doing that is important too. The QCAA does recognise that and has begun to put together some resources around this. So if you're not familiar with the cognitive verb toolkit, for example, and it's not subject specific, it's not. It provides examples of what analyse means in particular subjects, but what makes analyse subject specific in English is when we read analyse against the entire objective. What is it that we are analysing in English? Our syllabus objectives tell us this. But there's reflective tools and so on attached to this that you can use with students in your classroom that ask them to think about, do I actually understand this yet? What do I need to do to maybe improve my analysis in English and so on? So please again, touch base if you're not sure where to find these, but they are on the school portal and they may be of use to you in this process. Unit 4, what's specific to it? We've already flagged that it's about engagement specifically with the aesthetic in so many ways, but I just want to make the comment again that this should be a document for students. So I don't know, can I see a show of hands? I'm going to test you. How many people use the appendix of the 2010 syllabus to teach aesthetic features? Thank you, good on you, well done. That's fantastic, that's great. Sometimes we forget about Appendix 1 because it sits at the back. It doesn't anymore, it's at the front and it talks about style as well now in the 2019 syllabus. This is a syllabus for students as well and their understanding, and what a wonderful thing to begin the course with, but also continue to return to when we're engaging with this document with students for assessment and learning. And this is probably the slide everyone has been waiting for. Please feel free to take a photo. You are more than welcome to. And let me flag that the Senior Education Profile Calendar has recently been updated for 2019 and offers dates as well. Principals have had these dates for some time. They have. They've been thinking about them for some time and we've been releasing them in the latest syllabus workshops. We've just wrapped those up. And what they do is obviously provide the scheduling for confirmers and endorsers and those events, but more importantly, perhaps when we're talking about Unit 4 and our planning, as we currently do for verification and monitoring and consultation on the Form R7 and confirmation of the Form R6, we still need to plan to our moderation dates. And so when we're talking about that summative internal assessment 3, that imaginative response, we don't have to have that uploaded to the school portal for approval for endorsement, or endorsement, if you like, endorsement by endorsers, until the 31st of January 2020. That's not too alarming. I think we're okay with that one. The date that people start to think really about the implications of when they're going to teach, where they're going to teach, when they're going to start Unit 3 and all of these sorts of things, is the date for confirmation of results. And by the date for confirmation of results, what I'm saying there, I actually mean the upload of the data to the QCAA portal. So on the 21st of August 2020, the results for the English class will need to be uploaded to the QCAA portal. And what we mean by that, of course, is we've completed our internal quality assurance processes, we've done our cross-marking and our discussion. The data will be uploaded, and from that the QCAA will determine the sampling pattern to provide advice about the appropriateness of school judgments and to offer confirmation then of student results at that point in time. And so something that people have been talking about, particularly because the external assessment is in term 4, week 4, and it's a rolling schedule across the week, is, well, how do we do both of these assessment tasks? How do we actually provide enough time for students to prepare for this unseen paper, particularly if we're choosing, we're working with literary texts that are pretty hefty in the external assessment space, for example. Well, in a moment we'll look at coupling, again, of those texts and thinking very, very closely about, with the IA3, maybe it is useful to choose a selection of poetry for students to use as springboards for the imaginative response. Maybe it is useful to work with short story anthologies in order to do the imaginative response. Now, it's a school-based decision. Whatever works for your cohorts and your timetabling, you know best, which is why we cannot provide an answer. You know who's sitting in front of you. But it is something to think about. And the resources to help us and assist us with this, certainly the teaching, learning and assessment plans do take into consideration the dates. They do. However, as you may have realised if you've looked at the TLAPs, they're super long. Hey, I don't know how anyone could do 55 hours of notional teaching in that and learning and assessment. That's not a criticism. Let me explain it. As we have at the syllabus implementation workshops, they are intended as ideas, as a prompt, as a resource for Queensland teachers across sectors and different regional contexts and so on, to have a think about how are we going to plan our teaching, learning and assessment. So they are long for that reason, because we're trying to, I suppose, whet the appetite, offer ideas, etc. And you know, you may have visceral reactions to the TLAP for Unit 2, as many people did in the syllabus implementation workshops. People could see in the excerpt, because they're designed by Queensland teachers, the thinking behind what was going on with the post-apocalyptic experience. No one questioned that. But there were people that said, oh, can't wait to teach this with my kids, or not in our classroom, forget that, we're doing something else. Which is wonderful, because again it demonstrates the flexibility of our syllabus document. There are many ways in. So it's not so much about retrofitting this TLAP to fit your classroom. That's not really what it's about. And that's the same for the assessment instruments that are also provided. The Unit 4 TLAP, I'll speak to the text that it considers shortly. How these two are useful, I think, when you sit them next to each other, remembering that Unit 2 is a stepping stone for Unit 4. I think what they do really well is address these two questions. How do we actually foster a reading culture in our classrooms? But also, how do we foster a writing culture in our classrooms? And there's lots of examples of how they do this. And there's some lovely examples of it actually being a culture in the classroom, a collaborative culture in the classroom, one where there are lots of opportunities for students to practice and rehearse and do different things, and not just for assessment, but also in building 21st century skills, including literacy, and in aiming towards that syllabus rationale explanation at the start. And so here are just some examples from these two TLAPs, and you can see the increasing complexity when you look at one beside the other as well. Using a writing journal, and a lot of these won't be new to a lot of us, but it's worth thinking about. Using a writing journal, so skill building in these. Handwriting, because we are handwriting for our external assessment. It is likely that a lot of schools will be handwriting or continuing to handwrite for the internal assessment 3, the imaginative response as well. But also the journal as an assessment resource. Now, what the Unit 4 TLAP does in using the writing journal with its close study of a literary text is interrogate that text and offer lots of different writing prompts. It doesn't offer a predetermined response to what the paper will be, but by the time the students get to that same paper, where we are not actually providing them advice and feedback and so on, they've got this entire writing journal of ideas sitting there as a resource to address the question that's on the task sheet. It's not as if they walk in there on their own. They should feel prepared. There's a range of ways of writing as well offered in these TLAPs. Concept mapping, opportunities for editing and peer review, teacher modelling and feedback, that explicit teaching and reference to aesthetic features and stylistic devices from the syllabus. Also engaging with a variety of academic, public and other interpretations of genres and texts. We spend a lot of time sometimes pulling out sample assessment instruments from students who've gone before. We can't always do that with the syllabus that's on its way. How often do we put, and many teachers do, how often do we put academic writing in front of these students or media text in front of these students that show really sophisticated analysis of literary texts and unpack what they're doing with that as well? Because of course it's about the creative and the critical across these TLAPs. Also that notion that there is no one reading of a text. And that's what the 2016 and 2017 trials demonstrated. There were multiple responses that offered various interpretations of the literary text for those papers. And that's what we continue with. There's nothing in the syllabus that says there is one way to read the text. But that they actually get in there and they debate it. And they have conversations about this and how they would work with texts. And another clever thing I think about the way that Unit 2 and Unit 4 work, that post-apocalyptic experience and then what comes with the selection of 2 prescribed texts for Unit 4, is that Unit 2 uses lots of different texts and flavours and bits and pieces as creative writing prompts. Lots. And for critical reading as well. But then when we get to Unit 4, it's more about that really close reading of the 2 texts and thinking about the literary texts and the other analytical, etc. texts that support those. So they get to dip their toes in and then focus their attention in Unit 4. You'll know, if you've read the Unit 4 TLAB, that the prescribed text selected for the IA3 is Tim Winton's The Turning. Very distinctly Australian short story anthology. So again, thinking about perhaps a text that offers short texts even within it for the close study and for the prompts that offer creative writing for students, rather than a hefty text, perhaps like Hamlet for the external assessment, which is the text that belongs to the Unit 4 TLAP online from the QCAA. Now, that's the question that's asked at the start of the study of Hamlet in the TLAB. And it is a good question. It's a good question for students to ask as well. You may not immediately see the link between these 2 texts. They're from diverse times and places, hey, which is what our unit focus is about, but they don't have to be linked conceptually. There are ways in, certainly when we know these texts well, that you could see that you could do that, but they don't have to be. Again, you may have visceral reactions to each of these texts, and that's good because you're thinking about your contexts. You can use these 2 texts, but you don't have to. And what I'd really encourage you to do today, when you're walking around at lunchtime, and you're actually maybe going to Cat's Eye, or you're going to Hamlet or Macbeth or wherever you're headed, to actually ask people which text they are coupling with their external assessment text. What are they going to do for this imaginative task as well? Because it too is worth 25%, and it's important to consider them both across the course of study. We know that these are the text categories that we need to meet, and I'll just touch on that very briefly here because it's in the syllabus. So if you're doing a novel text, for example, for the external assessment, you know which text category are you going to pick for the IA3, but also for the assessment that comes earlier and for study of the text as well. So, time to raise your hands again so that you can look around and see who are my buddies today, who am I going to flag down and ask this coupling question of. Who's thinking of doing Hannah Kent's burial rites? Lonely soldier. That's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. Hannah Kent's burial rites, and there are other teachers across the state considering this. We have spoken to them. What about Cat's Eye? Poor Atwood. Just at this point in time? Hamlet? Aha, there are your friends. Look around, all right. What about Wuthering Heights and Heathcliff? Oh, Jane Eyre. Sorry, my apologies, I was reading something else. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I was reading something to do with Wuthering Heights before I headed in this morning. No one's doing Jane Eyre? Maybe thinking about it? Macbeth? Sorry, the Scottish play. The Scottish play. My apologies. Look at that. Okay. 1984. Thank you. The White Earth. Okay, and ETAC offered at a masterclass of the prescribed text list crash course. There was an excellent presentation on the White Earth and ways into this text as well. We are all completely beside ourselves. Okay, all right. That's interesting at this point in time. We know that there are schools using these texts across the state. We do. But it'll be interesting to engage in conversations, maybe as well if you meet somebody who's considering a text that you're not, have a chat with them about it as well. We're going to get onto assessment considerations now more specifically. I'll give you a moment with Calvin there while I just find my notes for these slides. Bless him. I don't think he's ever said a positive thing about education. But it is an interesting point that he makes. And I was recently reading a Queensland paper by John Carr on achievement in written English in Year 10. And we've already acknowledged, as we often do, that we begin a lot earlier than Unit 1 and certainly Unit 4 when we're considering creative writing, analytical writing, other text types, etc. It's more than NAPLAN, we know that. But I suppose in the syllabus implementation workshops, a lot of people were talking about, as I've mentioned, where does the analytical essay feature? Where does analytical writing feature? Can I just maybe flag? We need to ask that of the other text types as well. That's important too. And I know that Queensland teachers already do this, but just as a point, in part, because what this unit also offers is this beautiful quotation from Marcus Zuzak offered at the state conference last year, that hopefully this unit provides opportunities for students to actually breathe out their own stories, depending on the writing prompts and so on that we provide them with, whether it be an assessment or in the teaching and learning experiences that we offer them too. And so here are the specifications for this assessment instrument. And we know we're designing these. We're going to design valid and accessible assessment instruments so that they're endorsed to the syllabus specifications. The springboard is the text that we select from the prescribed text list. And just to note that if we are thinking about using poetry, that it's the poets that are prescribed, not the poems, as you'll know from reading the prescribed text list. And when we talk about text selection, it's a minimum of 5 in the Unit 3, Unit 4 course. So whichever poems they're using as prompts in the IA3, they would need to select a poem from a poet from the prescribed text list. And the sample assessment instrument that's offered by the QCAA online does that. It suggests that students have studied. It's not directly attached to the Unit 4 TLAP. It's another way of doing this assessment instrument. It suggests students have studied, for example, Ali Azadeh, Ali Kobi-Eckermann, I think Robert Browning, Sylvia Plath and Emily Dickinson. It's nice to see she's still around in their work, and that they can choose any one of the poems that they've studied in class as a writing prompt. The syllabus also provides examples of these tasks. And if you haven't seen these, it's useful, but we already do these across the state when we look at work programs. But there's nothing wrong with thinking about a new way into this task either, providing we meet the syllabus specifications as always. We know the short story example, and in fact in the syllabus implementation workshops, hopefully you got a chance to engage with the 2 samples when we were pulling apart the architecture of the ISMGs. One was a story about Don't Judge a Book by Its Cover. That poem didn't seem to offer much meat to that student, but the second response, which has been available as a standard A response by the QCAA for some time, Les Murray's An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow, that poem clearly offered that student some serious content to digest and think about in composing their own response. And what I can say she, because I know it was a she, what she did with this man crying in Martin Place in the middle of Sydney and this terrible reaction that people had to him, in actually turning it around and making it a woman crying in Luna Park, and how everybody got on board with her and her response, and they discovered things about their own humanity in this incredible setting that she established. It was a really excellent example, not the example, but excellent example of what this task can actually do for students and with students. We know monologues are popular across the state. If we choose a novel text, for example, for the external assessment task, well, if you're working with a play text, certainly this works, but also the monologue is an appropriate genre for this task. This is a popular one across the state too, the narrative intervention, which is the assessment instrument that's suggested for the study of Tim Winton in the Unit 4 TLAP. That actually students, and it's quite nice the focus of that task because the scope and scale of the instrument is quite specific. Students are going to add to that anthology. They're going to use the style of Tim Winton, which they've studied quite explicitly to that point in time, to contribute a new perspective, but it's going to focus on a turning for that character. And they've spent a lot of time looking across that anthology at how Tim Winton actually enacts the turnings of different characters there. And of course, there's other options available to us as well. But again, whatever best suits your students for this task. And that, of course, it needs to provide them with opportunities to demonstrate the range of performance levels described by the instrument-specific marking guides and meet the specifications. But certainly to prompt critical and emotional responses in the reader. And I think the critical is something that's particularly useful to us here. And I'm sorry, there is a comma missing. My apologies, I noticed it just before. But you know, when we start to talk with students about using a text as a prompt, when we start thinking about how we're actually going to set up this assessment instrument with students, yes, we want them to engage and to movers and so on. These things are quite difficult to assess, which is why they're not in the cognitions and qualifiers syllabus. But do we actually offer them opportunities to add something new, to bring something new to that text or in their own writing? Subversion can be really useful. We know challenging the text can be useful, but it's not the only way in. And I just want to restate that this is the same conditions for the 2010 syllabus, really, but the way that we work with this task is that once that task has been handed out, and we can read through the task certainly, and explain the task for understanding with students, of course we can, but then there's no access to teacher advice, guidance or feedback once that's distributed. So again, increasing complexity and challenge in the course of study offered in what we do, but also in our assessment. And they're about to head into an exam where they have no access to us at all. So there's reasoning behind placing this assessment here and continuing with these conditions. How you use that week prior with students, people ask that question a lot. Of course, that's entirely up to you. That's a school-based decision. The teaching, learning and assessment plan suggests that you might offer some time across that week for quiet writing, focused writing in class, where sure you're not helping them, assisting them, etc. But they actually have some focused time with their assessment instrument, and you can clarify any of the points on the assessment task for them without prompting ideas, etc. It also gives you a chance to authenticate student responses if you do it that way. But your timetabling and students and so on best, if you're teaching the next unit, there's nothing wrong with, topic for this unit already, then there's nothing wrong with that. And we also know that just because it's arranged in 2 topics, and that's neatly how it fits in the TLAPs online, you don't have to start teaching Hamlet after you've actually, finished that IA3. We can work with our texts earlier in the unit as well in building for the other assessments that will consider those texts. And just as it is now, it can be completed over more than one session. So there's a bit of freedom in the creative process here. And we know the writing task asks for this already in the QCS task. We won't have that moving forward. But students don't have to do it all in one session. They can spend some time drafting, planning, fixing up, go away, have a night or 2 or whatever it is to reflect, and then come back in and finish off that piece to assist in the creative writing process. But that must be completed within 5 school days, and part of that is around the authentication of that student response. External assessment. Let's look at the last piece. In contrast to that, and what we know so much of for the IA3 based on our current practice and so on, it looks a little lean in the syllabus, doesn't it, when you turn to that last page at the back and go, well, what do we do with this? that we know what the genre is. They're going to write the analytical essay response for a literary text, the close study, and the text will come from the prescribed text list and so on. The audience has a deep understanding of the text. We know the timing, we know the length, all of those sorts of things. But what else does the syllabus actually tell us? We actually know a lot as English teachers when we go into this exam if we engage with the information and the resources that are provided to us. And I'll unpack some of that right now. We have the assessment objectives. The EA has to assess the subject matter and specifications and syllabus requirements. It has to. And as it says here, it's used to determine student achievement in the following objectives. Objectives 3, 4 and 5, my apologies, describe what students are to analyse. And this is not new to us because we've already been doing this across the course of study. And we know how students will be assessed in some way around the development of their ideas and how texts work and genre patterns and conventions and so on. And when I say that, we have this statement in the syllabus. Who's had a chance to have a look at this statement in the syllabus? Okay, if you haven't got there, please do. Please go to the subject matter. Across the general syllabus suite, we have this statement that explains what an analytical essay is in our subject. And it might seem general, but there's actually a lot to hang our hats on here, to be honest, when we look at it. Because it does actually set up what the essay is intended to focus on. It does actually set up what a thesis is. It sets up who our reader is. It sets up how we actually substantiate what it is that we're arguing in the essay. And I think this would be an excellent resource actually to have sitting next to student work. When they're looking at what they're doing, are they meeting what this description actually offers? When we read the academic essays and so on of others, are they doing the same thing? And how do they do this? It doesn't prescribe a paragraph type, the QCAA never has, or a way of writing the analytical essay. It recognises that there are multiple ways in. And so that provides us some freedom in teaching as well, because we know what's best for our students. And I've just made that point before, in keeping in mind, not that we just work with samples and so on of student responses, but how do other people, academics and so on, actually engage in the analytical writing process in composition? The syllabus also tells us what a close study or in-depth study of the text actually is. Now, we might define that ourselves and we probably would hit the mark, I'm absolutely sure we would, but sometimes when we're talking with teachers on the phone, they haven't actually gone to the subject matter as described for each unit, which is organised under the 3 interrelated areas of study in our syllabus that we have, which is text in contexts, language and textual analysis, and responding to and creating text. And here's an example of one. And this sits under topic 2 of unit 4. In a way, these are the teaching and learning objectives for the unit. And again, the external assessment has to assess the subject matter of the syllabus. And what they do is they provide finer granularity, if you like, regarding teaching and learning around what our subject is and our discipline is and how this unit works than the unit objectives do and the assessment objectives do. There's one example there, but I'd encourage you to go and have a look. So this is also useful to us in preparing our units. And when you look at the TLAPs, you'll see that the subject matter is actually flagged. And we've made sure, even though appreciated they're very long, and all of the experiences we were thinking of were perhaps included, we've made sure that every objective from the subject matter is covered in each TLAP as relevant to the subject matter described for that unit or for that topic. What else do we need to consider? Let's talk about no quotation booklet. Let's talk about no text in the exam. And I'm going to speed up because I need to make sure we've got time for questions at the end. But there's good reasoning behind this. The first reason, the 2016 and 2017 trials demonstrated that students could write responses without using the quotation booklet, for example in 2016, and achieve what we call in the current system standard A, no problem. They could offer sophisticated ways of explaining the imagery, for example, in text and how it positions us as readers and develops representations and all of that, they could do it. They had an intimate working knowledge of the text versus the quote dump. And the cheeky monkey in me wonders whether some of those students thought, you know, everyone else is going to use that, I'm going to go my own way and not use the quotation booklet as well. But they can do it. And when we actually look to other jurisdictions, no other jurisdiction actually offers those conditions in external assessment. So when we go to, for example, when you actually look to the VCAA website and the NISA website just as examples, and you look at the retrospectives and you see what students write, you can see how they approach this in these conditions. They might use short quotations that they've learnt, but they can paraphrase, they can summarise the text, they can emphasise things, they can offer detail where they need to in their own words. And Queensland students can too. We would also, my apologies, we would also have had to consider the following things. It's really expensive trying to get copyright for contemporary texts. We would have been really stuck with, and stuck with is maybe not the right phrase, but very traditional texts, and we would have had to mandate the additions that you use. Because heaven forbid the kid walk in and not be able to understand the quotation or be thrown off by the quotation because it's not the same as what you had in your classroom. That's not okay. Providing quotations in a quotation booklet is also, as you may appreciate, selective in nature. It actually privileges perhaps a reading of a response or directs kids in a particular direction. It can be limiting, it can be over scaffolding. That's a huge thing to try and quality assure. And invigilating exam conditions, if they would all bring in their own text across the state, we know the locked boxes for QCS marking and the writing task and the secrets around that. How would we do that if everyone brought in their own text and make sure we had equitable conditions across the state and access for this assessment? We just couldn't do it. And we considered these points in syllabus implementation workshops. That slide just speaks to the fact that we're best placed to anticipate change in our own classrooms and how that will affect us. But people also considered the fact that they won't know the question and how that will affect them. This is what we shared across the state. These were some of the key ideas that people brought with them. The 3 ideas that they were most concerned about, or the 3 points they were most concerned about, or focusing on, I would say, rather than concerned, were exam preparedness, as a phrase, assessment literacy. Of course, students hopefully will have been building this across the course of study, and we keep talking about knowing the syllabus objectives and so on, and there will be mock assessment to assess students with this as well. But that these 2 things in particular would be key to managing anxiety for students. Because students are anxious when they don't know what to do and they don't have a strategy and they aren't confident walking into that paper. So it's not about rote learning, it's about concept mapping. It's about providing students with a strategy when they go in to do this, and actually not necessarily teaching one version of the text. It's about handwriting, it's about writing on demand to time and so on. And can I also just say, and I'll flick through these quite quickly now so we can go to questions, but if you haven't gone to the examiners' reports for the 2016 and 2017 trials, or it's been a while since you've read them, go back and read them with the lens of Unit 4 across them. Just to bring everyone up to speed, they were really useful to us in the Queensland system, thinking about reintroducing external assessment, thinking about how we would set up our marking operations, but also evaluating our processes. And we got some serious data out of these trials from Queensland schools. When you read them, keep in mind they are for the 2010 syllabus, so they will, for example, refer to evaluate, but there's so much in them that is relevant. And they require students to do what they will need to do. And again, you'll notice in the examiners' reports, not one essay is entirely published. That might change in the future, but there's good reasoning behind that there were so many variations in responses, and we actually didn't want to privilege any one way of responding in the analytical essay as well. And here's some synthesis. And this is why the recount and the rote learning wasn't working for students. They came in and answered the question they wanted to answer rather than the question that was asked. The reports provide some really useful information about what analysis actually is in our subject. That the kids who analysed and did so well considered the text as a complete work. They knew what we meant by underpinning ideas, attitudes and values in the texts, and they advanced their arguments through reason, that they could see the consequences and the resolutions to the problems established by the text, and they were able to actually explain the constructedness of the text, as well as relevant to their arguments, rather than dumping in aesthetic features and devices and so on as they went in. Versus students who dwelt on one particular character or section of the play. It tells us a lot about conclusions as well, this report, and what a successful conclusion does. That flexible control of paragraphing and cohesive techniques was really important to these responses that were successful. That where we over-scaffolded the assessment, where we forced a particular structure on students, it actually didn't help them always in their responses. We know there are students that need this assistance in particular instances, but when we're talking about the responses that went beyond, they didn't try and insert particular sentences where they didn't fit, etc. It didn't lead to a listing of points where they didn't actually synthesise, and they didn't just drop quotes in as well. They were able to actually use quotations if they did to ensure that their essay continued fluently. And to be honest, you could cut the quotations out and the analysis stood. Register was important. And this relates to the constructedness of the text, doesn't it? And understanding who you're writing for, but that an author or a playwright actually wrote this text and made choices. And that in this interpretation that I'm offering in my essay, I'm going to unpack those choices made. As well, something related to over-scaffolding sometimes of the assessment paragraphs and so on, or the essay paragraphs, was that students struggled to direct their reader through the argument when they were doing these things as well. And just the final points here. They were able to vary their sentence structures. And this is key to our analysis, I guess. What do you turn up? What do you turn down? What do you emphasise? What don't you? What do you generalise about and what don't you? And that some students really struggled in their vocabulary choices when they were generalising. The old relatable text. I don't know what that means. I don't know if they know what that means, but it appears, not necessarily in these essays, but I've seen it of late in looking at samples. And that punctuation was actually of an assistance to them in constructing their work rather than something that they were unsure about. Much of this is not new to us, but again, what a wonderful resource to use with students. What a wonderful resource. And so I'm going to wrap up now, and this is where we've been. If we don't get to everybody's questions today, as I've said, please feel free to touch base or grab me, but there is just so many resources on the website to support you in this process. We know that the external assessment reports now are under the new system tab of the website. If you have not signed up to QCAA memos, please do. For example, when we're talking about special provisions in the future system around external assessment, but also internal assessment, that's actually described by our QCE Policies and Procedures Handbook, the new A to Z. That actually won't be available, or isn't available yet, but it will be very soon. And you will know, because QCAA memos will tell you when it is available. The online accreditation training, if you're interested in being an external assessment marker, course 7 will be available closer to 2020, okay? But keep an eye out for that, we really want you in, as well as confirmers and endorsers, obviously, and we'll be calling for applications through the QCAA portal too. The QCE and QCI Policy and Procedures Handbook, like the A to Z, will detail all of the considerations around assessment that the syllabus doesn't set up. It's that principle-based handbook to assist Queensland schools. So other than that, thank you very much. I appreciate it was very chalk and talk, but I hope it's set up a foundation for the other sessions that you'll attend today, and I really wish you all the very best. And please know, as always, that the QCAA really is here to support you. Don't ever call up and apologise for wasting our time. We love to hear from you. You are our bread and butter, and we are here for you. That is our purpose, to support Queensland teachers and schools. Thank you very much.